Welcome to Sherlock Shadow Channel, where every story hides a secret. Grab your coffee, sit back, and dive into a world of twists and turns. Tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Hercule Poirot and the Death at the Willow Tree Crossing. Chapter 1. The Inciting Incident. I have often thought that there are two kinds of death: the quiet passing of natural causes, and the sudden rupture of violence that leaves a stain on everyone who witnesses it. On the evening of September 14th, as the silvery light of a waning moon filtered through the bent branches of the old willow by the riverbank, I experienced the latter. It was under that mournful tree, known to local villagers as the Willow Tree Crossing, that a body was discovered, and my friend Hercule Poirot's quiet holiday was shattered before tea had even been served. I had accompanied Poirot to this rustic corner of Oxfordshire under the guise of a gentle retreat. The charming Willowmere Inn was reputed for its tranquil gardens and the proprietor's legendary apple tarts, and my dear friend was determined to swap London's bustle for a few days of contemplation, his little grey cells at rest. As for me, I welcomed any excuse to leave boarding houses and Baker Street behind, if only for a short time. Our host, Mrs. Penfold, a sprightly woman with rosy cheeks and an apron perpetually dusted with flour, had insisted that we take the river path at dusk. "The willow glade is most picturesque when the moon is high," she said, as though reciting lines from a pastoral poem. Poirot, ever the arbiter of propriety, accepted with a nod, his waxed moustaches twitching with approval. I, however, felt a prickle of unease as we set out, for something in the hush of that evening air hinted at secrets best left unearthed. The path wound along the gentle curve of the River Cherwell, its waters reflecting ghostly ribbons of silver. Beyond the fence of reeds, an owl hooted once, and the distant church bells tolled 6 o'clock. Poirot walked with an elegant precision, his cane tapping in time with his deliberate gait, while I trudged more clumsily, mind between cheese and pickle sandwiches rather than celestial reflections. "Mon ami," Poirot murmured, pausing beneath the willows. "Observe the pattern of footprints in the soft embankment." I knelt to examine two parallel sets, one small, one larger, trailing down to the water's edge. "A lady's slipper, perhaps," Poirot said. "And a gentleman's?" I nodded, but before I could ask why the footprints ended abruptly, a faint cry reached us. It was not the plaintive cry of a bird, nor the rustling of wind through leaves, but a human sob, fragile and terrified, echoing from the shadowed undergrowth. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "The game, Hastings, has begun." Chapter 2. The First Clues. The sobbing ceased as abruptly as it had begun, and in that sudden silence the night seemed to press in closer. Poirot and I exchanged a look, his dark eyes glinting with a blend of curiosity and concern. With measured steps, he advanced toward the tangle of brambles and shadows from which the sound had issued. I followed, my heart pounding, uncertain whether we would find a witness or another victim. "Stay behind me, Hastings," Poirot whispered, parting the branches with his cane. There, crouched on the damp earth, sat a young woman. Her fine muslin dress was dirt-streaked, and her face was pale as milk under the moonlight. She lifted trembling hands to shield her eyes. "Monsieur Poirot," she gasped, voice quavering. "It's terrible. He's dead. Please, you must help me." Poirot knelt before her, his manner as gentle as ever. "Mademoiselle, calm yourself," he murmured in French, soothing and precise. "Tell me what you have seen." Her eyes filled with tears, and she blinked wildly as though each star overhead threatened to judge her shame. I came here after dinner," she stammered. "I meant only to think, to pray." She traced her fingers to a locket at her throat, a simple gold heart etched with intertwined initials. "I thought this nearness to the river, the Willow, might—" She broke off, pressing lips to the locket. But then I heard a splash, and a cry I thought was mine. I ran, and found him. "Found whom, mademoiselle?" Poirot's voice was calm, yet I sensed the urgency beneath his courtesy. She swallowed. "Mr. Julian Merrow. He lay here at the water's edge. I suppose he lost his footing, or someone pushed him." Poirot's brow furrowed. "His name is Merrow?" He turned to me. "Hastings, recall that name. Julian Merrow of Merrow and Company Shipping Lines. He was our fellow guest at the inn." I nodded, having met Mr. Merrow briefly at dinner, a tall, dark-haired man with a restless energy and slick city suit that looked out of place by the riverbank. Poirot studied the ground between us and the bank. "Observe, Hastings. The footprints we saw earlier. They do not continue beyond the water's edge. Yet these," he gestured to a new set of prints, larger and deeper, leading away from the victim toward the lane behind the Willow. Someone returned from the river, perhaps to conceal evidence, but note how the sole of the boot is imprinted with an unusual pattern, 3 daisies encircling a compass rose. I knelt to inspect the imprint. The soil was soft, but the pattern was distinct. "That is singular," I murmured. "I have never seen such a design." "Precisely," Poirot said. "It is no mass-produced pattern. We must find the owner of that boot." He stood, offering his hand to the young woman. "Mademoiselle, would you accompany us to the Willowmere Inn? There you may rest and provide further details." Her lips trembled in gratitude as she rose. She stumbled slightly, and I half supported her. By her side, Poirot guided her toward the lane, his eyes sweeping the shadowy wood as if expecting more secrets to emerge. The willow's branches swayed in the breeze, as though whispering warnings we dared not heed. Back at the inn, the common room was lit by a single oil lamp, its flame dancing on polished oak panels and casting a warm glow over the assembled guests. Mrs. Penfold bustled forward with a pot of tea and blankets. "Oh, you poor dear," she cooed to our witness, covering her shoulders with a tartan shawl. "We'll get you a hot cup right away." Poirot declined the tea, but accepted a warm blanket draped across his coat. "Merci, madame." Then he turned to me. "Hastings, I believe we have our first genuine clue and, alas, our first genuine witness. But there is more. Come, let us gather all who were in the vicinity this evening." Reluctantly, several guests emerged from adjoining parlours. Mr. Julian Merrow's business partner, Ms. Eloise Fairfax, a tall woman with an air of quiet steel, and Lieutenant Douglas Carrington of the King's Own Rifles, whose uniform gleamed under the lamp. There was also Mrs. Louise Gardner, an elderly widow, and the inn's travelling pianist, Mr. Theodore Blanchard, his fingers still stained with charcoal from sketching the river on a pad. Poirot rose, folding his hands neatly. "Mesdames et messieurs, an unfortunate event has occurred beneath the Willow. Mr. Merrow sustained fatal injuries and was found in the water. Whether by accident or design, we do not yet know." He paused, eyes lingering on each face. "I must ask you all to recount your movements this evening, beginning after dinner." Miss Fairfax spoke first, voice steady. "After dinner, I retired to the sitting room to review correspondence. I did not leave the inn until I joined others here." Lieutenant Carrington cleared his throat. "I went for a brief stroll along the lane, but returned when the church bells chimed 6. I was passing the Willow when I saw nothing unusual. Mrs. Gardner fiddled with her knitted muffler. I stayed in my room, reading by lamplight. I heard nothing but the wind. Mr. Blanchard adjusted his collar. I sketched until 8 o'clock, then played the piano for half an hour. The common room was empty during that time. Poirot jotted notes in his small ledger. Then he turned to me. "Hastings, approach the window, if you please." Outside, the willow branches swayed in the moonlight. "Do you see that small white envelope pinned to the fence post?" I leaned forward. Indeed, a folded piece of stationery, fastened by a rusty nail, caught the lamp's reflection. I opened the window and retrieved it. The envelope bore the seal of Merrow and Company. A stylized anchor entwined with rope. Inside was a single sheet, scrawled in tight, hurried handwriting. "To J.M., meet me where the water whispers, come alone or never." Poirot held the paper aloft. "See you, Hastings. The message is dated today, September 14th, and the ink is barely dry. The sender anticipated secrecy, urging Mr. Merrow to come alone to the Willow. Yet someone accompanied him, the lady we found. Did he bring her willingly, or was she forced?" A murmur rippled through the room. Miss Fairfax's sharp eyes narrowed. Lieutenant Carrington's jaw clenched. Even Mrs. Gardner seemed to draw in her breath. Poirot turned to our witness, who sat huddled beneath the lamp's glow. "Mademoiselle, did Mr. Merrow share the contents of this note with you? Did he appear anxious?" She shook her head, her tears now spent. "He showed it to me just before we left dinner," she said in a whisper. "He said only that it was a private matter, but he seemed troubled. He asked me to walk with him, to keep him calm." "And did you read the note yourself?" Poirot asked. Her lips curled with regret. "Number." He folded it quickly and tucked it under his coat. She closed her eyes. "I never saw it until you showed it here." Poirot nodded slowly. "Very good. You did well." He folded the note, slipping it into an envelope. "I believe, Hastings, that this enigmatic invitation and the strange imprint on the boot are our primary clues. Our man was lured here deliberately. He did not slip by accident. Someone intended his demise." I swallowed, staring at the group. But who would want Julian Merrow dead? He was well liked, wasn't he? "Ah, Hastings," Poirot replied, his voice tinged with that familiar amusement. "You have only scratched the surface. In high society, men like Merrow carry many debts, financial, personal, and political. As for being well liked, that, mon ami, is often a mask for envy." He looked around the room, eyes alighting on each face in turn. "We shall begin our inquiries in earnest at dawn. Tonight, I suggest you all retire early. Tomorrow, we shall see who among you carries guilt heavier than the night air." As the guests dispersed to their rooms, Mrs. Penfold offered me a slice of apple tart. I accepted, but my appetite had fled. Beside me, Poirot gazed thoughtfully out the window at the silvering river. "The game is afoot, Hastings," he murmured, "and the Willow holds more than shadows." I nodded, the weight of anticipation settling upon us both. Outside, the wind rustled the Willow's branches, as though eager to whisper its secrets into the night. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. At dawn's first light, the Willowmere Inn was a study in hushed tension. The common room's oak floorboards creaked under nervous footsteps as guests filtered downstairs, drawn by Mrs. Penfold's insistent calls for coffee and toast. Yet no one spoke above a whisper. The memory of last night's tragedy hovered like a pall. At a long, polished table, Hercule Poirot sat between Miss Eloise Fairfax and Lieutenant Carrington, his posture impeccable as he surveyed the assembled circle. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his French accent lending gravity to his words, "we convene now in a spirit of candour and cooperation. Yesterday evening, Mr. Julian Merrow was lured to the Willow Tree Crossing under a false pretense and met his end there. It is our task to determine whether his death was accident or design. For that, I must know each of you more fully." He tapped the tabletop with a single finger. "Let us proceed in order of arrival at the inn." First, Mrs. Louise Gardner rose. The elderly widow chose her words carefully, voice quavering but dignified. "I arrived 3 days ago, escaping London's bustle after my husband's passing. I sought solitude here. I keep to myself." She paused, adjusting her shawl. "I knew Mr. Merrow only by sight at dinner. I admired his kindness to the inn's staff." Poirot inclined his head. "Thank you, madame. And you heard nothing unusual last night?" "Only that muffled sob," she replied, eyes cast down. "It pierced my sleep, but I thought it a troubled dream." Next, Mr. Theodore Blanchard, the pianist and occasional sketch artist, stepped forward. He was slender, with ink-smudged fingers and a restless gaze. "I arrived last evening after an afternoon recital in Oxford. I had intended to rest, but insomnia drove me to sketch the riverbank by moonlight." He pulled a folded sheet from his breast pocket and laid it on the table, a nocturnal charcoal rendering of the willow and its reflection. I saw no one until I heard the sob. His eyes met Poirot's. "Art sharpens the senses, monsieur." "Très bien," Poirot nodded. "May I keep this sketch?" "By all means," Blanchard replied, relief in his tone. Lieutenant Douglas Carrington was next. Tall and broad-shouldered, his step was military precise as he stood. "I arrived yesterday morning by carriage with my regiment's leave. I was to visit relatives in the area, but found the inn's reputation too tempting. I ride horses and shoot at the local club." He paused, voice firm. "I knew Mr. Merrow from social circles. He and I shared a membership at the London Rifle Club." Poirot's moustache twitched. "And did your acquaintance with him bring you closer, or perhaps engender rivalry?" Carrington's jaw tightened. He never even mentioned his shooting record. I suspect he thought it beneath him. "But no rivalry, monsieur." Poirot gave a small, inscrutable smile. "Très bien." Miss Eloise Fairfax rose with an air of cool authority. She was impeccably dressed in charcoal grey riding habit, her hair pinned with military precision. "I arrived by train 2 evenings ago to settle family affairs, an inheritance dispute I hope to resolve quietly. I knew Mr. Merrow professionally. Our shipping lines negotiated passage contracts for aristocrats." Her pale blue eyes flicked to Carrington. "I hoped for an amicable settlement, but business, like grief, can sour easily." Poirot's gaze lingered. "Noted, mademoiselle." Finally, our witness, the young woman who found Merrow, rose shakily. She wore the simple muslin dress still bearing, stains of mud and river water. Poirot stepped forward. "Mademoiselle, would you introduce yourself?" She swallowed, voice hushed. "I am Clara Denby. I live in the village. My family runs the bookshop in Willowmere. I came to this inn often for tea and conversation. I knew Mr. Merrow as a guest, nothing more." Poirot studied her face, so young and frightened. "You kept company with him after dinner. Did you know of his business interests?" Clara shook her head. Number We spoke of trivialities, books, the river, the willow's beauty. He seemed troubled but silent when I asked why. Poirot made a note. "Thank you, mademoiselle." With introductions complete, Poirot rose and walked to the large window overlooking the inn's courtyard. The tended garden, with its neat rose beds and gravel pathways, stood in stark contrast to the wild willow grove. He turned, face grave. "You are all here because fate has brought you together under tragic circumstances. Yet one among you holds knowledge of the note, and of Mr. Merrow's invitation." He allowed his gaze to sweep slowly. Mrs. Gardiner, Blanchard, Carrington, Fairfax, and Clara. "In order to progress, I require two things. First, each of you must surrender any written correspondence you exchanged with Mr. Merrow in the past fortnight. Second, you must account precisely for your movements between 6 and 8 yesterday evening." His voice was crisp, leaving no room for evasion. Lieutenant Carrington cleared his throat. "I have no correspondence with Mr. Merrow beyond formal invitations to the Rifle Club. I was at the stables from 6:30 to 7:15. Then I walked the grounds until dinner." Ms. Fairfax produced a neat bundle of letters. "We corresponded regarding shipping contracts. You are welcome to inspect them." She handed the letters to Poirot, her expression unreadable. Mr. Blanchard dug in his satchel for a moment, then withdrew a single postcard. "He sent this after my recital, praising my playing and offering to recommend me to patrons. I was sketching from 7 until 9. Mrs. Gardiner shook her head. "I wrote to no one. I spent my evening in my room, reading old letters from my late husband. The only letter I had was from his estate lawyer, unrelated to Mr. Merrow." Clara Denby hesitated, then offered a slender notebook. He asked me to keep a diary of our conversations for a local newspaper he intended to write. I have it here." She handed it to Poirot, hands trembling. Poirot placed the papers carefully on the table. "Excellent. These documents will reveal motives and connections. Now regarding your whereabouts. You each declared presence in various parts of the inn or grounds, yet only one of you emerged with the ink to write that summons. Meet me where the water whispers. That handwriting is agitated, slanted, and cramped. Who among you is accustomed to such penmanship?" Silence fell. Then Miss Fairfax spoke, voice low. "I tend to write meticulously with measured strokes, not in haste." She glanced at Lieutenant Carrington, who remained impassive. Blanchard shrugged. "I write only sketch notes, sporadic, not elegant flourishes, not like a formal summons." Mrs. Gardiner coughed. I have terrible eyesight. My handwriting wobbles, but I would use a large letter, not these small, cramped characters." Clara's lips parted. "I write sentences for the paper, neat enough for publication, but this is not my style." Poirot stared at each in turn. "And you, Lieutenant?" Carrington's face clouded. "My handwriting is standard military block, large, clear. This is different." Poirot laid a finger on the note atop the stack of papers. "Then the callous pen that lured Mr. Merrow belongs to someone here who denies any written exchange, someone who believes they will not be suspected. But the imprint on the boot, the stolen steps at the water's edge, and this note are interconnected. The person who penned it also returned to conceal the body." He took a deep breath, voice softening. "We have much to uncover, and each of you will remain under my inquiry until the truth emerges. For now, thank you for your candor. We shall break here for lunch. Hastings and I will examine these documents privately." As the group dispersed to wash and dine, I caught Poirot's eye and noticed a slight nod, the smallest sign that his little grey cells were already at work, weaving backstories into threads of suspicion. Outside, the morning sun burned away the mist, but beneath its warmth, the investigation's chill remained. The circle was closed, The suspects assembled, and one among them was a murderer. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. A crisp breeze rippled across the river as Hercule Poirot, cane in hand, descended the narrow lane toward the willow tree, crossing shortly after midday. Beside him walked Inspector Bedford of the Oxfordshire Constabulary, a solid man with a determined expression and a notebook already half-filled. I followed, notebook in my own hand, keen to observe how my friend would conduct himself now he re-entered the very scene of the crime. The constable's horse-drawn cart was parked near the fence, its wheels sunk slightly in the soft earth. Bedford led the way to where the willow's branches dipped low, brushing the water's surface. Yellow markers still indicated the spot where Mr. Julian Merrow's body had been found. A slender length of yellow tape, anchored to 2 stakes, cordoned off the immediate area. A small group of villagers had gathered at a respectful distance, curious eyes peering through the reed-like shadows. Poirot paused at the edge of the cordon, his moustaches bristling with purpose. He scanned the scene with that precise deliberation I have come to know so well, the way his eyes measured distances, noted angles, and catalogued the minutest details. Then he turned to Bedford. "Inspector, I believe this gentleman was no mere accident. The riverbank soil shows signs of deliberate concealment." He stepped inside the markers. Bedford looked to me for permission, and I gave a subtle nod. Under Poirot's gaze, the constable backed away. Poirot crouched, examining the muddy embankment. "Observe here," he said, pointing to a rounded indentation half hidden by a fallen willow branch. "This depression is too regular to be natural. Someone pressed this log deliberately against the bank to cover footprints or stains." He lifted the branch with his cane and traced his finger along the soil. "Hastings, do you recall the footwear imprint we noted in the inn? The boot with the compass, rose, and daisies? I believe the same soul made these tracks, then returned to drag this log." I knelt beside him and ran my finger along the indent. "Yes, I remember. But the branch is heavy. Would one person manage?" Poirot straightened, eyes alight. "Monsieur is both strong and determined when motive drives him. But notice also," he added, tapping another section of bank, "that someone else returned later to widen this indent, perhaps to ensure no one would stumble at the cover-up. 2 sets of hands, Hastings." Inspecting further, Poirot rose and cleared his throat. The villagers shifted anxiously. A stout farmer, Mr. Tallow, stepped forward. "Beg pardon, sir, but is this a public right of way? We've heard talk of more men coming to investigate." Poirot offered the man a polite bow. "Indeed, sir, but the area is now under official inquiry. While we examine these particulars, I must ask that bystanders keep their distance." He turned back to Bedford. "Inspector, see that this boundary is respected. No one approaches without my leave." Bedford nodded and raised his hand to the spectators. "Please step back, folks. We'll notify you when it's safe." With the crowd dispersed, Poirot turned to examine the water itself. He removed a leather-bound case from his coat pocket and produced a fine glass vial. With practiced care, he scooped up a sample of the river water and capped it. "We shall test this for traces of substances, perhaps sedatives or poisons used to incapacitate Mr. Merrow." He paused, sliding the vial back into his pocket. "Poison in the water would explain a sudden collapse followed by a staged fall." Inspector Bedford consulted his notebook. "I took samples this morning, but only of soil. I can arrange for water to be tested in Oxford." "Excellent," Poirot replied. "And I would appreciate photographs, if you please." Bedford nodded and signalled to a constable, who approached to document the bank and the log. Poirot walked the perimeter of the cordon, cane tapping softly. He pointed to a crushed reed lying near the stakes. "Hastings, see this? The reeds here are flattened toward the water, then crushed upward beyond the markers. Someone ran down, then stumbled or braked sharply before leaving." His eyes narrowed. "And that fall happened after the body was laid. The secondary indentations indicate panic, footwear unsteady, perhaps lace undone or slipper loose." I jotted notes as Poirot continued. Then he paused at the fence post where the envelope had once been affixed. The post was now bare, but a faint pattern of discoloration remained. Poirot pressed his thumb to it, wiping away a bit of grime. The glue from the seal leaves residue. Anyone touching the post would smudge their fingers. "There are prints here, too small and irregular for a gentleman's hand, likely Mademoiselle Denby." He looked toward the village. "She was our witness, Hastings." Before I could respond, Clara Denby herself appeared at the far edge of the group, guided by Mrs. Penfold and Inspector Bedford. Her eyes were wide, but she appeared steadier in daylight. Poirot called to her. "Mademoiselle Denby, will you join us here at the crossing?" She approached, head bowed, and hurried shoes scuffed the grass. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, voice steadier than before, "I came as soon as the inspector called." He nodded kindly. "Thank you. Now, I wish to know precisely where you stood when you found Mr. Merrow." He gestured to the soil indentation, "Here, or a few paces further." Clara looked down at her shoes, then indicated a spot slightly upstream. "I was behind that willow trunk," she whispered, pointing to a knotted root jutting from the bank. "I stepped here, then looked down." Poirot walked over to the tree and crouched at Clara's mark. He brushed away a few leaves to reveal flattened grass. Then he rose, addressing both her and the inspector. "Mademoiselle did not come closer than necessity demanded. She tripped over this exposed root." He lifted the log aside to show the root, and stumbled backward. Her fall startled her into flight, explaining why the footprints led away abruptly. She did not approach the body, so she could not have moved it. Clara's shoulders eased. I did not touch him," she murmured. "I ran for help." "Precisely." Poirot smiled warmly. "You are honest, mademoiselle, and your testimony stands." He turned back to Bedford. "Inspector, I submit that only one person could have pinned that note to the post, lured Mr. Merrow here, and orchestrated both footprints and concealment. That person must have returned later, likely under cover of night, to tamper further with the scene. Your men should review the guest register. Who left and returned in the hours after dusk?" Bedford made a quick note. "I will have the registers checked at once. 2 guests did return after a late supper, Miss Fairfax, who claimed to retrieve documents, and Mr. Blanchard, who said he forgot his sketchbook. Their statements will be examined." Poirot inclined his head. "Excellent, and please supervise discreet surveillance. The murderer may still be within the inn." The inspector looked surprised, but nodded. "Very good, monsieur." As we turned back toward Willowmere Inn, Poirot paused once more by the water. He gazed at the willow's reflection, rippling with each passing cloud. "Hastings, mon ami, observe, the currents here are gentle. This place is chosen for its quiet beauty, not for concealment. Yet our culprit saw opportunity, isolation under the willow's shade, no lanterns to betray movement, and the river to hide evidence. A perfect trap." I shivered, imagining the scene that night, the lure, the fall, the hidden hand dragging a body into darkness. Poirot slipped the vial from his pocket and held it up to the light. We have much to learn from this small sample. For now, Hastings, let us return to those letters and sketches. The suspects are assembled. The crime scene yields its secrets. Soon the culprit's mask will slip. And with that, he led the way back up the lane, leaving the Willow to whisper its secrets to the river once more, secrets that only Poirot's little grey cells could fully discern. Chapter 5. Initial interviews. Begin by mid-afternoon, the drawing room of Willowmere Inn had been arranged for private interviews. Heavy damask curtains were drawn against the autumn chill, oil lamps cast a gentle glow over the deep-set armchairs, and a low fire crackled in the hearth. Poirot sat in his customary posture, back straight, legs crossed, with his little black notebook resting on his knee. I took the seat opposite him, my own notebook at the ready. One by one the suspects were ushered in, each under the pretense of cordial inquiry. Miss Eloise Fairfax entered with practised elegance, still clad in her riding habit. Poirot greeted her in French and then in English noted that she had claimed to retrieve business documents after dinner, yet her papers contained no urgent amendment. She explained that she discovered a costly omission in a contract's margin and needed to correct it before posting. Her voice remained calm, but a tremor betrayed her nerves. When pressed about writing by moonlight at the riverbank, she admitted only to briefly clearing her mind on the path and turning back out of fear. Poirot resolved to verify her story with the inn's staff. Lieutenant Douglas Carrington followed, uniform sharp and boots polished. He maintained he had walked alone to the stables to calm his thoughts, though hoofprints near the Willow suggested otherwise. Poirot revealed that the boot imprint at the scene combined a floral motif with a military tread. Under pressure, Carrington confessed he wore his brother's botanist boots while his own were being repaired. Poirot decided to confirm this detail directly with the lieutenant's brother. Mr. Theodore Blanchard, the inn's pianist and sketch artist, appeared next. Poirot produced Blanchard's charcoal rendering of the Willow and pointed out two shadowy forms included in the nighttime sketch. Blanchard stammered that he must have inserted them unconsciously, thinking them drifting reeds. He admitted seeing movement at the periphery, but dismissed it as a trick of the light. Poirot made note to verify whether anyone else had been near the crossing at that hour. Finally, Mrs. Louise Gardner sat quietly knitting. Poirot presented a snippet of ribbon matching the yarn she used, suggesting it might have sealed the summons note. She revealed she had lent the yarn to Mr. Merrow earlier to mend his gloves, but denied any involvement in the invitation to the Willow. Her demeanour grew firmer as she recounted his kindness and concern. When the last interview ended, Poirot tapped his pen thoughtfully. We now had clear motives: financial stakes for Fairfax, pride and rivalry for Carrington, artistic secrecy for Blanchard, and emotional gratitude for Gardner. Yet none had explained who penned the cryptic note or staged the scene. Poirot declared his intention to unsettle the suspects at dinner with a playful deduction exercise, hoping the pressure would crack their composure and reveal the culprit's true nature. The psychological game had begun in earnest, and the key to unlocking the mystery lay hidden within their next reactions. Chapter 6. The first false lead. The next morning, a hush of anticipation settled over Willowmere Inn as the news spread. Inspector Bedford had arrested Miss Eloise Fairfax on suspicion of orchestrating Mr. Merrow's death. The charges were based on two seemingly damning pieces of evidence: an annotated shipping contract bearing Fairfax's unmistakable signature style and a hastily scrawled postscript that matched the handwriting of the summons note, "Meet me where the water whispers." Moreover, the ink used in the margin amendment, tested against the residue on the fence post, proved chemically identical to the ink in the summons. The local constabulary, eager for swift justice, had declared the case closed. At breakfast, the guests gathered in strained silence. Miss Fairfax sat at one end of the long table, flanked by uniformed constables. Her riding habit had been replaced by a simple grey dress, and her composure was unnaturally calm. She took tea with measured sips, her pale face as serene as marble. Lieutenant Carrington, seated opposite, leaned forward. "Eloise, this is preposterous," he whispered, voice tense. "Your documents were penned weeks ago. How could they match the note?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I cannot fathom it. I amended the contract 2 days prior to Mr. Merrow's death, well before any summons was written. The postscript in question refers to legal clauses, not a clandestine meeting." She allowed a thin smile. "Someone has forged my handwriting to frame me." Mrs. Gardner sat beside Carrington, knitting needles idle in her lap. Mr. Blanchard hovered at the edge of the room, sketchbook clutched to his chest. Clara Denby lingered by the window, eyes downcast. As Poirot entered, the murmur of conjecture ceased. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said softly, "it appears the constabulary has deemed Miss Fairfax culpable, but I invite you all to remain patient." He moved to stand at the head of the table, cane in hand. Justice must be based on irrefutable truth, not haste. Inspector Bedford exchanged a look with Poirot, then nodded. "Mr. Poirot has requested I hold further proceedings until he has presented his findings." He indicated that the guards might release Miss Fairfax temporarily. As the constables removed Fairfax's handcuffs, she rose and glided toward Poirot. "Monsieur," she said quietly, "I thank you for intervening. I am innocent. I implore you to discover the truth." He inclined his head. "Rest assured, mademoiselle, we shall uncover the real culprit." With the arrest and subsequent release of Miss Fairfax, the inn's atmosphere grew stifling. Guests exchanged sideways glances, and dinner that evening was eaten in near silence. Poirot, seated at his usual spot, toyed with a piece of bread while observing each face with serene intensity. When the meal concluded, he tapped his spoon against his plate. "Mes amis, I propose we examine the timeline and the evidence impartially. Let us begin with the ink analysis." He produced 2 small vials, one containing ink scraped from the margin amendment, another from the summons note. Both are identical. This is indisputable. Yet correlation is not causation. He paused, drawing the group's attention. "Ms. Fairfax," he addressed her gently, "you wrote with such an ink in your correspondence, yes?" She nodded, as did many of us. Fountain pens were common among gentlefolk. He turned to Lieutenant Carrington. "And you, sir, did you ever use this ink?" Carrington frowned. "Number." "My letters are typed or written in standard military issue ink, black and quick drying." Poirot placed the vials side by side. "Notice the subtle difference in viscosity. This ink is a domestic blend, favored by artists and homemakers alike." He looked at Mr. Blanchard. "Might your supply match this?" Blanchard shifted uncomfortably. "I have numerous inks for sketching, sepia, charcoal black, but nothing of special blend. I purchase standard artist's ink." Poirot's gaze then settled on Mrs. Gardner. "Madam, you lend your yarn. You sew with a steady hand. Do you possess similar ink for your letters?" Her knitting paused. I write to friends by hand, yes, but I use standard blue-black ink, nothing remarkable. Poirot tapped his cane. Then whose hands would mix domestic compounds? The postscript's slanted strokes and ink pooling suggest hasty blending, perhaps someone unfamiliar with fine writing. He moved back to the table. Now, regarding the signature style, Ms. Fairfax's amendments display precise artifice, each comma placed deliberately, each loop closed firmly. Yet the summons note's script is shakier. Commas are heavy, loops uneven, and letters occasionally retrace themselves. He pointed to enlarged copies of both. The contract amendments are flawless. The summons note is rushed. The margin alteration bore no such haste. As the guests studied the comparison, Clara spoke up, voice soft but clear. I have studied handwriting in books for a local newspaper article. The contract amendments exhibit consistent pressure, but the summons note shows tremors in the writing, indicative of nervousness. She paused, meeting each gaze. Someone attempted to mimic Fairfax's hand but could not control the pen. Poirot smiled approvingly. Very astute, mademoiselle. The real author of the summons was under stress, likely anticipating confrontation. They forged the postscript after completing the genuine amendment. Inspector Bedford interjected, "Then why would the ink tests match so precisely?" Poirot rose and retrieved a small inkwell from his coat. Because the culprit borrowed ink from the same source, this bedside inkwell in Ms. Fairfax's study, knowing it would link her to the summons. But they overlooked the marginal differences in how Fairfax writes versus how they themselves would write. He laid the inkwell on the table. And who among you had access to Ms. Fairfax's study after her departure? Heads turned. Carrington's jaw tightened, Blanchard's eyes darkened. Gardner's knitting needles clicked uncertainly. Clara Denby's grip on her shawl tightened. Poirot allowed a measured silence to linger before continuing. Furthermore, Ms. Fairfax's signature on the amendments was witnessed by the inn's steward at midday, 2 days before the murder. Yet the forged postscript was pinned to the fence in the dead of night. The author returned to Ms. Fairfax's study, took ink, and attempted mimicry. That return would leave footprints. He directed everyone's attention to a pattern of scuffed mud on the corridor outside Ms. Fairfax's study. These prints, unswept by the servants, bear partial resemblance to the daisy compass imprint, but lack its floral precision. They match Lieutenant Carrington's brother's boots exactly. He looked pointedly at the lieutenant. Carrington's face drained of color. I borrowed the boots to impress a fellow officer during target practice." His voice trembled. "I returned them hours ago, but I never took them past the corridor." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yet someone wore them, not you, to forge Fairfax's signature. And someone returned to the scene to mislead the constabulary. The timeline places Lieutenant Carrington's boots in 2 places, the study corridor and the riverbank, at night." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The inspector arrested Ms. Fairfax on superficial evidence, but the real culprit enjoys the benefit of that distraction. Inspector Bedford looked from Carrington to Poirot. "Lieutenant, do you deny being at the crossing after dusk?" Carrington's shoulders heaved. I went to the riverbank, yes, not to the Willow, but to think." His eyes flicked toward Miss Fairfax. "I never intended. I wanted no one to suspect me." Poirot stepped forward. "And yet, Lieutenant, you suspected Miss Fairfax, did you not? By planting evidence to frame her, you diverted suspicion from yourself. But your plan was flawed. Only a monstrous mind could believe a crime of this nature could be solved so easily." He turned to the inspector. I believe the lieutenant's motive stems from jealousy, perhaps in business or personal pride, and his method was to craft a false lead so glaring that no one would look beyond it. Bedford approached Carrington cuffed. "You are under arrest for the murder of Mr. Julian Merrow." Carrington's eyes met mine with hollow defeat. Poirot watched, expression inscrutable, as the guards led the lieutenant away. Alone with Poirot, I asked softly, "Was this truly a false lead?" He confessed to being at the bank, but did he kill Merrow? Poirot tapped his temple. Hastings, the author of the summons, and the first to return by night are one and the same. But whether his intent was to murder or merely to discredit Miss Fairfax remains to be proven. The fabric of this case is now unravelling. He looked out the window at the willow grove. Monsieur Merrow's death may yet reveal a second hand, another actor unseen whose motive and method are hidden in shadows. I nodded. "Then our investigation continues." Poirot's moustaches twitched in a barely perceptible smile. "Indeed, Hastings, the first false lead is behind us, but the true trail awaits in the depths of the human heart." Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. That evening, the drawing-room glowed with lamplight and the rich scent of rosewood polish. A low fire crackled in the hearth, and the gathered guests, Miss Fairfax, recently freed, Mr. Blanchard, Mrs. Gardner, and Clara Denby, sat stiffly in a rough semicircle. The arrest of Lieutenant Carrington earlier that day had unsettled them all, and now, under Poirot's invitation, they awaited whatever psychological gambit he had devised. Poirot entered, cane in hand, moving with an almost theatrical slowness. He paused at the centre of the group, moustaches bristling like antennae tuned to each heartbeat in the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice calm yet charged, "tonight we play a small game of truths and half-truths. You will each answer a question. Your answers must be honest, or the deception will betray you." A shadow of apprehension flickered across Clara's face. Mrs. Gardner clutched her shawl. Mr. Blanchard shifted in his seat. Even Miss Fairfax's composed facade wavered. None dared ask what game Poirot had in mind, but all recognized the stakes. Reveal too much, and one's guilt might surface. Reveal too little, and one's evasions would scream louder than confessions. Poirot tapped a slender finger on his cheek. "First, Miss Fairfax, you claimed that you feared nocturnal miscreants on the river path and turned back. Yet you walked past the willow earlier today and paused before entering your study. What did you see that made you hesitate?" Fairfax's pale eyes widened. She drew a slow breath, voice measured. "I saw footprints, large boot prints, pressed deeply. I recognized them as Mr. Carrington's brother's boots. I thought perhaps he had come here earlier in the night and returned. It made me uneasy." She met Poirot's gaze steadily. "I said nothing because I feared implicating an innocent man." Poirot inclined his head, eyes glittering. "Very good. You spoke truthfully under pressure. Yet you feared accusing the lieutenant, even when your own safety was at risk. Curious." He turned to Blanchard, who sat hunched, as if hoping the cushions would swallow him whole. "Monsieur Blanchard, your charcoal sketch included two shadowy figures, one tall, one slight. You claimed they were mere drifts of branches, but this evening you lingered by the piano in the hallway. What compelled you to draw near the servants' corridor?" Blanchard's fingers twitched. He swallowed. "I heard whispering. Two voices speaking in low tones. I thought perhaps a rehearsal for a play or staff gossip. I did not wish to eavesdrop, but curiosity drew me closer." His voice faltered. "I recognized the voices, One was Mrs. Gardner's. A flicker of colour left Gardner's cheeks. Poirot kept his gaze on Blanchard. "And what did you hear?" Blanchard bowed his head. "I heard mention of the locket and the debt. I walked away before more, fearing idle gossip." He looked at Mrs. Gardner, regret in his eyes. "I did not report it at once. I feared I might be wrong." Poirot tapped his cane. "You will provide me with that corridor's exact location, monsieur. And you, Madame Gardner, will confirm or deny those words." The widow's knitting needles clicked once, twice, then stilled. She raised a trembling hand. "We spoke of Mr. Merrow's kindness. He lent me money when I was in need, after my husband died. I vowed to repay him, but my finances are meagre. I owed him more than gratitude." Clara Denby's soft voice broke the tension. "Repayment? Why did this transaction remain secret?" Gardner's eyes filled. "I was ashamed," he insisted, saying he admired my resilience. "But later I felt beholden, unable to refuse him. I feared he might mention it to others, so I kept it hidden." She clasped her shawl. "I never told anyone, not even my sister." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "A secret debt can be burdensome indeed, and yet you insisted you lent him yarn for his gloves. Yet here you admit a far greater debt." He turned to Clara. "Mademoiselle, you have observed them both. What did you see when you encountered Mrs. Gardner at the riverbank?" Clara swallowed, recollecting the night. "I saw her hurry past the Willow's shadow. Her shawl, a deep crimson, brushed his coat. She asked if he needed help crossing the creek. She paused. He declined and moved on. I thought it merely neighbourly concern." Poirot's eyes shone. Helpful concerns often have hidden motives. "Tell me, Clara, why did you not mention this earlier?" Clara bit her lip. "I feared implicating Mrs. Gardner unjustly. She seemed distraught. And I feared drawing suspicion away from the real culprit." She closed her eyes. "I wasn't certain who it was." Poirot's lips curved in a small smile. "Caution is wise, yet caution can cloak guilt." He moved to the hearth, and retrieving a small crystal decanter, poured each guest a glass of Madeira. "A toast to truth in the face of fear. Drink, and let your words flow more freely." Reluctantly, they raised their glasses. The amber wine caught the lamplight like a glowing ember. One by one they sipped, and with each turn of the decanter, Poirot's questions deepened. "Miss Fairfax," he resumed, "why did you never mention Mr. Merrow's sudden anxiety after opening the summons note, though Clara was with him?" Fairfax's glass trembled. "I thought it a private matter between them. I should have spoken up, but I hesitated, fearing scandal." Her gaze flicked to Clara, guilt mingling with relief. "Blanchard," Poirot pressed, "those two forms in your sketch. Did you recognize them at the party last night?" The pianist closed his eyes. "One was Mrs. Gardner, stepping away after dinner. The other? It was Mr. Merrow himself returning to the Willow. I saw them talking." He opened his eyes, voice low. "They argued about money, I think. Then he left alone." A hush fell. Poirot leaned forward, voice soft but insistent. "Argument under the willow. Did it turn violent?" Blanchard shook his head. Number She implored him to stay, then ran back toward the inn. I drew instead of intervening." Poirot rose, cane tapping twice. "Courage comes in many forms, monsieur. Yet when argument turns to violence, courage must override hesitation." He turned to Mrs. Gardner. "What was the substance of your argument with Mr. Merrow?" She closed her eyes, took a trembling breath. "I begged him to forgive me for my debt, I offered repayment, but he refused, saying friendship transcends money. We fell into anguished words. She faltered. I did not harm him. I left him by the Willow, distraught but alive. Poirot surveyed the group, setting down his empty glass. And so, the psychological game reveals threads of motive: financial desperation, fear of scandal, jealousy, gratitude turned to obsession. Each of you harbors a concealed truth. Under sufficient pressure, the cracks widen. He allowed a moment of silence to settle. Then he smiled, tapping his temple. Rest now, mes amis. Tomorrow we press further. The hidden heart will speak through action, and the river will deliver its final secrets. They rose, relief and dread mingling in their expressions. As they filed from the room, Poirot turned to me, eyes alight with triumph. Hastings, you see, by sowing doubt in each mind, I have coaxed hidden truths to the surface. Soon the murderer will reveal himself not through words, but through a gesture he cannot control. I nodded, awed by his method. Outside, the willow's branches swayed in the night breeze, as though applauding the little grey cells at work, and whispering promises of the revelations to come. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. The following morning dawned pale and mist-shrouded over Willowmere Inn, as though the world itself hesitated to emerge from the previous night's revelations. Over breakfast in the common room, conversation was subdued. The arrest of Lieutenant Carrington had cast a long shadow, and each guest nursed their coffee with trembling fingers. Poirot sat at the head of the table, his face inscrutable, while I observed the others' furtive glances and half-formed anxieties. Just as Mrs. Penfold placed a steaming pot of Earl Grey before me, my cup, already filled, tipped unexpectedly against the saucer. The tea sloshed over the rim in a thin, dark ribbon. "Mon Dieu!" I exclaimed, startled by a sudden dizziness. I clutched the edge of the table as the room seemed to tilt. Poirot sprang to his feet, knocking his chair back. "Hastings, are you well?" His voice cut through the haze. I swallowed, tasting something oddly sweet beneath the bergamot. Before I could answer, my vision swam, and I collapsed sideways, my head striking the wooden floor with a dull thud. Gasps rose around me, and Mrs. Penfold screamed. Poirot crouched instantly at my side, his little grey cells already racing. He shook my shoulder gently. "Hastings, Hastings, speak to me." When I didn't respond, he swept aside the breakfast tablecloth and pressed his fingers to my wrist. My pulse was rapid but weak. Miss Fairfax rushed forward. "We must fetch water, let me help." She clattered a tray of toast onto the floor as she knelt beside me. Mrs. Gardner hovered, shawl clutched to her chest, while Mr. Blanchard backed away toward the corner, eyes wide. Clara Denby stood frozen, clutching her diary. Poirot leapt to his feet and addressed the gathering guests. "No one is to leave this room. Mrs. Penfold, call Inspector Bedford at once." He turned to me, voice softer. "Mon ami, focus on my voice." Gently, I forced my eyes open. He offered a steadying hand. My head swam less fiercely, though a bitter aftertaste lingered on my tongue. Inspector Bedford arrived within minutes, accompanied by a local doctor. They bore medical kits, and the doctor quickly examined me, noting dilated pupils and clammy skin. "Poison," he muttered. "A sedative, perhaps mixed in his tea, but the dose was insufficient to kill, more to incapacitate." He injected an antidote, and after tense moments, my breathing steadied. I felt warmth return to my limbs. Poirot watched the doctor close his kit. "Thank you, Doctor. You agree this was deliberate?" The doctor nodded gravely. "Certainly, and the tea was prepared here in front of witnesses. The cup was yours alone." He gestured to the upturned tablecloth and lacquered floor. Poirot surveyed the room, steel gleaming in his eyes. Someone among us attempted to silence my friend, either to prevent his investigation or to divert suspicion. We have moved from a single murder to an ongoing conspiracy. He addressed the assembled guests. No one is to leave Willowmere Inn until this matter is resolved. As the doctor administered water and rest to me, Poirot turned to Miss Fairfax. "Mademoiselle, did you see who poured the tea?" She shook her head, voice trembling. "No, but I noticed the teapot was brought from the kitchen by Mrs. Gardiner." The widow's knitting bag dropped to the floor with a soft thump. Clara Denby gasped. Mrs. Gardiner's hands flew to her face. I only carried it. Mrs. Penfold placed it here." She backed away, voice shaking. "I assure you I touched only the handle." Poirot's gaze flicked to Mr. Blanchard. "And you, monsieur, did you watch the tea being poured?" Blanchard shook his head. "I was sketching the garden through the window. I saw no one near your cup." He swallowed nervously, glancing at Clara, then at the door. Clara Denby spoke at last, voice small but firm. "I left the room to fetch my diary from my room. When I returned, the table was already set. I did not see who prepared the tea." Poirot nodded, turning to the inspector. "We must secure the tea. A sample, the cup, saucer, and teapot. The crime scene now extends to this very table." Bedford barked orders to 2 constables, who carefully bagged the items. Poirot continued quietly. "The poison was mild, enough to incapacitate but not kill. The malicious intent was to remove Hastings from the field, to break my trail. We must ask who benefits from stalling our inquiry." He allowed his eyes to rest on each suspect. Fairfax's pale composure, Blanchard's jittery frame, Gardiner's trembling shawl, Clara's tear-streaked cheeks. Then he turned to Mrs. Penfold, who stood by the doorway. "Madame, did you notice any unusual behaviour in the kitchen staff this morning?" Mrs. Penfold wrung her hands. "My cook, Mrs. Munro, was uneasy. She asked for a day off 2 hours before service, saying she felt faint. She left immediately after breakfast." Poirot's brow lifted. "And she took with her a thermos of tea made from the same pot?" The innkeeper nodded. "Yes, but she was too distraught to explain." Poirot tapped his cane on the floor. "Excellent. We have a secondary lead, Mrs. Munro's abrupt departure and her access to the teapot. It seems our culprit arranged her exit or disguised themselves as staff to tamper with the tea." He turned back to Bedford. "Find Mrs. Munro and question her about the tea and whether anyone asked her to fetch the pot from that service." As the inspector departed, Poirot returned to my side, gentle concern in his eyes. "Hastings, you must rest. But tell me, did you taste anything distinctive in the tea?" I closed my eyes, recalling the bitter sweetness. "A hint of lavender or chamomile, something floral." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "A rare tincture, used in local herbal remedies. Someone with knowledge of such remedies, perhaps Mrs. Gardiner, whose yarn and knitting hide a naturalist's curiosity." Mrs. Gardiner's knitted shawl tugged visibly as Poirot mentioned her. She lifted her chin, composure returning with defiance. "I would never harm Mr. Hastings. I knit only to soothe anxious minds." Poirot's eyes softened. "Courage, madame. The yeast of truth rises slowly. We must follow this new thread. Who stood to gain by hobbling my investigation, and who possessed that floral knowledge and access to the teapot?" Clara Denby spoke again, voice firm. "I saw Mrs. Munro handling herbs in the pantry last night, lavender and chamomile. She prepared tea for the guests at breakfast. A murmur rose among the suspects. Poirot nodded. Then Bedford must question her. We now have two crimes, the murder of Mr. Merrow and the attempted poisoning of Mr. Hastings. The same hand could be responsible for both, or the second might be a desperate act by an accomplice fearing exposure. He turned to me, smiling gently. Mon ami, you have intercepted the next move in our game. Rest now, and leave the little grey cells to me. As Mrs. Penfold and the doctor guided me to my room, I glanced back through the doorway. Poirot stood among the remaining guests, his silhouette framed by the lamplight, as though commanding an audience even in absence. Outside, a ragged breeze rustled the willows, a reminder that the darkest secrets of Willowmere Inn were far from revealed. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. By the following dawn, Willowmere Inn seemed gripped by a hush more intense than the morning mist. Hastings, still pale from poisoning, sat by the window of his room, watching the river's eddies catch the light. Poirot stood beside him, cane in hand, peering at the swirling water as though it might reveal its secrets to those who listened closely. Then, without a word, he bade Hastings to rest and descended the stairs to convene the remaining guests in the oak-panelled library. As I drifted into a light doze, I dreamed of dancing willows and whispered threats. A soft knock roused me, and Mrs. Penfold entered with a bowl of broth and a gentle smile. Monsieur Poirot requests that you join him when you feel able, she said. He wishes to reveal certain connections. I nodded, swallowed my broth, and, steadied by Poirot's supportive arm, made my way down. In the library, the morning sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting coloured patches on the Persian rug. Miss Fairfax sat beside Mr. Blanchard, hands folded in her lap. Mrs. Gardiner occupied the high-backed chair by the fireplace, knitting needles, clicking with nervous rhythm. Clara Denby hovered near the bookcases, clutching her diary as if it were a talisman. Poirot stood before them, face grave yet animated by purpose. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, voice soft yet commanding. We have two pressing matters, the untimely death of Mr. Merrow and the attempted silencing of my friend Hastings. Both acts required not only opportunity, but also intimate knowledge of your movements, your secrets, and your relationships with the victim. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Now, I shall reveal certain connections you may not know you shared, and we will see where the threads entwine. He paced slowly, cane tapping. First, Miss Fairfax, your shipping contracts passed goods through the very docks owned by Mr. Merrow's company. Yet I discovered an unsigned ledger among his papers, entries indicating payments made to you under the guise of consulting fees. He looked at her. Miss Fairfax, confess, you and Mr. Merrow were more than business associates. These payments were hush money, for what indiscretion? Her composure flickered. She drew a breath, lips pressed tight. We were involved, yes, she admitted. It began as an arrangement. My contracts needed his influence, and he desired my company. But I ended it when the marriage rumours began. He threatened to expose me if I refused further meetings. Her eyes glistened. He claimed I owed him a debt of passion. A murmur rippled through the room. Poirot inclined his head. Very well, now, Mr. Blanchard. I found in your sketchbook a folded note from Mr. Merrow encouraging you to compose music for a private gala at his estate. Yet that gala never occurred. He held up the note, elegantly written in cursive. Mr. Blanchard, you owe him more than an artistic commission. You sold him information about the inn's guests, their backgrounds and their secrets. He fixed the artist with a calm stare. You were his informant. Blanchard swallowed loudly, face paling. I needed money, he whispered. He paid well, and he threatened to ruin my reputation if I refused. He glanced at Fairfax. He said he could make or break me. Poirot nodded. The web tightens, Mrs. Gardner. You confessed to a hidden loan from Mr. Merrow. I have here your promissory note, unsigned but in his hand, stipulating repayment by next week, with interest at an exorbitant rate. Yet your purse is empty. He tapped his ledger. He intended to call in that loan publicly to disgrace you. He studied her. Your gratitude turned to desperation. Mrs. Gardner's hands trembled. I had no choice, she said. My late husband left me nothing but debts. I begged him to forgive me, but he refused. She glanced at Clara. He said only I could save my reputation by repaying him. Poirot turned to Clara Denby. And you, mademoiselle, your diary reveals that you and Mr. Merrow were childhood friends. He once saved you from drowning in this very river when you were a child. He sighed. He confessed to you then that he adored you, that he intended to propose upon his return from London. Yet you never responded. He paused. Clara, your silence was a wound to him. He visited you last night, not solely for discourse of the Willow's beauty, but to plead once more. Clara's cheeks reddened. I did not love him, she stammered. He pressured me, said he would not be denied. I asked him to leave me in peace. Her voice broke. I begged him, then ran. Poirot's gaze softened. Your heart was yours to guard, but he wounded you with his insistence. He folded his hands. Now observe. Each of you had a motive: shame for Fairfax, blackmail for Blanchard, financial ruin for Gardner, and emotional torment for Denby. Each reason sufficed to drive a desperate act. But note what you share. All your entanglements converge on Mr. Merrow's precarious power to threaten or reward. He tapped the ledger again. Yet only one among you possessed the combination of knowledge, opportunity, and skill to stage both crimes, the murder at the Willow and the attempted poisoning. That person had access to Merrow's papers, to the inn's inkwell, to the mixture of herbal poisons, and to the intimate details of each of your secrets. They knew how to frame another. He stepped closer to Mrs. Gardner. Madame, you had keys to the study. He gave them to you to repay his loan by retrieving documents. You could enter at will, see the locket in Clara's diary, forge amendments, and pin the note to the fence. He looked at Blanchard. You had the sketchbook and knowledge of the bank's geography to stage the shadow tableau. He looked at Fairfax. You had his payments and could mimic his manner. And at Clara, you knew the river's current, the hidden routes, the depth where one might drown. The suspects exchanged startled glances. Poirot lifted a hand. Yet consider who benefits most from eliminating all four of you, who held the greatest grudge and who stood to inherit from setting you against one another. He allowed the silence to stretch, forcing each to contemplate their shared guilt and the unseen puppeteer behind it. Then he tapped his temple and smiled faintly. Mon ami, into the tangled thicket of motives and connections, the smallest thread can unravel the whole tapestry. Tomorrow, at the Willow crossing, we shall follow that thread to its source, and the true culprit will be revealed. As the guests dispersed in uneasy resignation, I followed Poirot out of the library. The Willow's boughs brushed the windows as if eager to whisper further secrets. Poirot paused, eyes fixed on the dancing leaves. The connections are hidden, Hastings, but not unfathomable. Each strand points back to one mind, a mind capable of weaving such a deceitful web. He tapped my shoulder. Now we rest, for tomorrow the game reaches its climax. Outside, the river flowed on, indifferent to the human dramas bound to its banks. Yet within its reflections lay the final truths, waiting for Poirot's little grey cells to bring them to light. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. That afternoon the sun slipped behind gathering clouds as Poirot gathered the remaining guests in the billiard room, a spacious chamber lined with dark mahogany panels and the mellow scent of well-aged Kew chalk. One by one, Miss Fairfax, Mr. Blanchard, Mrs. Gardner, and Clara Denby took their seats around the green felt table, expressions warily expectant. Poirot stood at the apex, cane in hand, his moustaches bristling with quiet purpose. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice low yet insistent, "we have now reviewed your motives and the connections that bound you all to Mr. Marrow. We have seen how each of you might have sought to harm him. Yet motives alone do not convict. We must follow the evidence." He tapped the surface of the table. "Allow me to share a small discovery, one that eluded everyone until now." He paused, allowing the hush to deepen. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a slender black leather case. From it he produced a tiny porcelain fragment, no larger than a fingernail. He held it aloft between thumb and forefinger. This was found entangled in the roots of the willow at the crossing, half buried in the mud, where the body was first concealed. At first glance it appears insignificant, yet it bears a maker's mark, a delicate monogram L.B. He passed the fragment to the nearest guest, Miss Fairfax, who turned it in her gloved hand. "L.B.," she murmured, brows knitting. "I do not recognize it." Mr. Blanchard took it next, eyes narrowing. "Could be decorative china, common in tea sets." Poirot nodded. "Exactly, but note this. The monogram is reversed, as if viewed through glass. The fragment comes from the interior of a teacup, broken in haste, then carried to the river. We know the teapot used to poison Hastings this morning. The matching cups bear no such mark. Therefore, this fragment belongs not to the tea service, but to a private set, one known only to the household." He looked at Mrs. Gardner. "Your late husband's heirlooms, perhaps?" She paled. "My porcelain set spells my initials L.Ju, not L.B. I have no such china." Poirot's gaze shifted to Mr. Blanchard. "And you, monsieur? Your art supplies include pigments derived from porcelain glazes, but have you ever used fragments such as these?" Blanchard shook his head. "Never. I would not mar my supplies so." Clara Denby's hand trembled as she took the piece. "L.B. Could it belong to the inn's owner, Mrs. Penfold's maiden name?" Poirot's moustaches quirked. An astute suggestion, but the Penfold service bears no monogram at all. He replaced the fragment in his case and pocket. "No, this monogram belongs to one person here, our final suspect." He straightened, shifting his weight discreetly. "Allow me to explain why this fragment is pivotal." He retrieved the folded summons note from his breast pocket, placing it on the table near the fragment. This note was penned on stationery bearing the same L.B. watermark, a subtle pressed initial at the top corner. I discovered it only after comparing the fragment's glaze to the paper's watermark under ultraviolet light. He tapped the note. Thus, the person who summoned Mr. Marrow not only used that private china, but also the same paper, stored in their own desk. A startled hush fell. Miss Fairfax's eyes darted to Mrs. Gardner, then to Blanchard. Blanchard shifted in his seat. Mrs. Gardner's knitting fell to her lap. Clara's cheeks blazed. Poirot continued, voice softer now. "The killer lured Mr. Marrow under false pretenses, using stationery reserved for personal correspondence. They broke a treasured cup, likely in a moment of haste or anger, then concealed the fragment at the crime scene. In poisoning my friend, they used the common teapot to mislead us into believing a second hand was at work. Yet only one person had access both to the Willowmere's china wardrobe and the common service, the owner of the initials L.B. He paused, letting each guest digest the revelation. Clara Denby swallowed. Mrs. Gardner's lips parted in shock. Mr. Blanchard's fingers curled around the edge of the table. Miss Fairfax's face was a mask of disbelief. Poirot tapped his cane. I do not reveal this to accuse prematurely. Instead, I keep this clue close, that I might observe who among you reacts most strongly to the knowledge that your private property and stationery have been exposed. Under such pressure, a guilty conscience reveals itself in the smallest tremor, an averted glance, a sudden cough, a rigid posture. He surveyed the group with calm intensity. I shall remain silent on this matter until the moment is right. Tomorrow at the crossing, we will reconstruct the crime. You will each handle evidence, speak of your actions, and we will see whose composure cracks first. He smiled thinly. The little grey cells have shown us where to look. Now we wait for the culprit to unmask himself. As he returned the summons note to his pocket, he looked at each suspect in turn, his gaze lingering longest on the person whose initials matched that monogram. Yet he betrayed nothing beyond polite attention. He tapped the table once more. Mes amis, you may now retire. Consider well what you have heard. The next step will bring us closer to the final revelation. With that, he bowed and turned, his silhouette framed against the window, where the willow's branches danced in the growing dusk. One by one the guests rose and left the room, their minds awhirl with suspicion and dread. I lingered, watching Poirot's thoughtful expression as he retrieved the porcelain fragment and concealed it in his case. You have discovered the heart of the mystery, mon ami, I said softly. Poirot nodded, eyes alight. Indeed, Hastings. The greatest clue often lies hidden in the smallest corner. Now we wait. Outside, the river's current shimmered in the fading light, carrying toward the willow the final echoes of truth yet to be spoken. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The evening air in Willowmere Inn was thick with unease as guests assembled once more in the drawing-room. Oil lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wallpaper, and the low murmur of conversation ceased as Poirot entered, ledger in hand. He nodded courteously to Miss Fairfax, Mr. Blanchard, Mrs. Gardner, and Clara Denby before taking his seat beside me. Each bore the weariness of sleepless nights and the tension of secrets half buried. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, voice calm yet charged, we have considered motives, connections, false leads, and even a secret clue. Tonight, I invite you to handle certain items of evidence, to speak of your own actions, and we shall observe the reactions that follow. He allowed a moment's pause, letting anticipation build. Hastings, if you please. I rose and placed 3 objects on a small table. The broken porcelain fragment bearing the monogram L.B., the torn edge of the summons note, and the vial of river water Poirot had collected at the crossing. The guests shifted uneasily. Please, Poirot said gently, take each item in turn, hold it, and recount your movements when I ask. He turned first to Miss Fairfax. Mademoiselle, will you hold this fragment? Fairfax rose and took the porcelain piece gingerly in her gloved hand. Her fingers trembled. I recognize it now, she whispered. It belonged to my grandmother, Lucy Beaumont. She gave me a service on my 21st birthday. Her voice caught. I keep only 1 cup, This fragment must be from the matching saucer I lost years ago. Tears formed in her eyes. I thought the entire set was gone. She lowered the fragment, face ashen. I was proud of that heirloom. To see it here, I fear someone stole it to frame me. Her voice wavered. But how did they know of it? Poirot inclined his head. Merci, mademoiselle. He replaced the fragment in my hand and turned to Blanchard. Monsieur, the summons note. Will you hold this? Blanchard approached, his steps tentative. He unfolded the scrap of paper, eyes narrowing as he read the jagged edge. This paper, I painted with it once, experimenting to extract the watermark under alcohol light. It bears my fingerprints. His voice rose. I only borrowed a drop to test a pigment. He glanced around, breath quickening. Someone must have used my experiment to write the note. His knuckles whitened. I did not intend harm. I only wished to learn of the monogram's origin. He met Poirot's steady gaze. I swear I wrote no summons. Poirot nodded. Très bien, monsieur. Your honesty is appreciated. He placed the note aside and addressed Mrs. Gardiner. Madame, will you examine this vial? Mrs. Gardiner rose slowly and accepted the vial of river water. She peered through it, the pale liquid catching the lamplight. This morning I walked the bank to collect wild chamomile for tea. I dipped my fingers in moments before I held this vial. Her cheeks flushed. I would never harm Mr. Hastings. I only sought solace in herbs. She set the vial down with trembling hands. I cannot bear these suggestions that I poisoned him. Poirot offered her a sympathetic look. Madame, your upset is understandable. Yet the presence of lavender, unusual for a gentleman's brew, points to someone knowledgeable in herbal mixtures. Clara Denby's eyes darted among the others. Poirot beckoned her. Mademoiselle, would you share where you were when these items were handled? Clara swallowed and stood. I was in the hallway, searching my diary for the evening's entries. I saw Miss Fairfax approach the fragment table, Mr. Blanchard in the corner with the note, and Mrs. Gardiner by the sideboard with the water. Her voice grew firmer. I watched them, unsure what to do. She paused, then added softly, but I saw someone else, Inspector Bedford, enter the room just before the tests, carry the items to Poirot, then leave without a word. It struck me as odd. A collective murmur rose. Poirot placed a hand over Clara's. Excellent observation, mademoiselle. He leaned forward. The inspector's interest is procedural, yet his presence now suggests urgency beyond routine. We shall consider that later. He sat back, gaze sweeping the room. Now, mes amis, we have observed each of you with the evidence. Your reactions, shock, fear, indignation, tell us of your connections, but only one among you displayed a calm mastery of these items, able to manipulate their meaning to frame another. His gaze settled on Miss Fairfax. You recognized your grandmother's china, yet the fragment was planted deliberately to implicate you. He turned to Blanchard. You saw your own fingerprints on the summons note, yet you did not confess writing it. Instead, you accused someone of misusing your experiment. His gaze then shifted to Mrs. Gardiner. You claimed you dipped your fingers in the river, yet you neglected to mention gathering herbs. Each suspect sat rigid, bracing. Poirot tapped his cane lightly. And you, mademoiselle, observed the inspector's movements, a detail you could only know if guided to the doorway. He paused, letting the implication hang. Someone orchestrated every moment tonight to test how each of you would react. He stood, beckoning the inspector back into the room. In strode Inspector Bedford, expression grave. Poirot inclined his head. "Inspector, I need your confirmation. Did you enter this room to handle the evidence before any of us?" Bedford nodded. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. The items were retrieved from locked storage, placed here for your demonstration." He paused, eyes narrowing. "I did not alter them." Poirot smiled, turning to the group. "There we have it, a staged display to see who falters, who shrinks from the spotlight, and who remains composed under false accusation." He tapped his temple. "And only one of you had the foresight to plant the seed for this psychological test." His lips curved. A puppet master, perhaps, hidden among the wires. He stepped closer to Mrs. Gardner. "Madame, your affinity for herbs and your access to tea preparations made you an ideal suspect for poisoning, yet you recoiled in horror, not recognizing the vial's purpose." He then moved to Blanchard. "Monsieur, you are an artist, accustomed to fingerprints and pigments, but your indignation was genuine." He paused. "And you, Mademoiselle Denby, your keen observation reveals you to be no mere bystander." His gaze finally returned to Ms. Fairfax. "However, Mademoiselle Fairfax, you remained outwardly calm, composed, even when holding evidence that should have shaken you. You answered with precision, citing family heirlooms and fetching witnesses to confirm your story. A true conspirator must have rehearsed these lines." Fairfax's lips parted, but no words came. Poirot advanced and gently took her gloved hand. "Tell me, mademoiselle, did you practice these remarks before tonight?" Her shoulders slumped. "Yes," she confessed, voice barely above a whisper. "I feared tonight's demonstration. I knew you would test us with evidence." Poirot's little grey cells smiled. "Exactly so. You anticipated the game, prepared your defense in advance, and thus remained unshaken. Yet the true culprit is the one who set the game in motion." He turned to Bedford. "Inspector, will you arrest Ms. Fairfax for conspiracy against these attempts and the staging of tonight's psychological test?" Bedford hesitated, brow furrowed. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch. Then, with a nod, Bedford stepped forward and gently took Moz, Fairfax's arm. Fairfax looked at Poirot with a mixture of relief and sorrow. As she was led away, Poirot turned to the remaining guests. "The tensions have risen to the surface. The culprit is the one who needed to divert suspicion constantly, ever prepared for every contingency." He paused. "We are now one step from the truth." Outside, the wind rattled the inn's windows, as if urging the final confrontation ever nearer. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. Late that evening, the drawing-room of Willowmere Inn was arranged for an extraordinary assembly. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the worn Persian rug. Poirot stood at the far end, cane in hand, while I sat beside him. The surviving suspects, Mr. Blanchard, Mrs. Gardner, and Clara Denby, occupied chairs arrayed before a small side table. Between them lay the key pieces of evidence: the summons note, the porcelain fragment, and the teapot from breakfast. A hush fell as Poirot surveyed the group. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice measured, "we have journeyed together from murder through misdirection to revelation. Tonight I propose a final test, a confrontation to expose the truth hidden by half-truths." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. "Each of you shall address the room in turn, recounting exactly what you did on the night of September 14th, from dusk until midnight. Any hesitation, any omission, and the threads of deceit will unravel." Mrs. Gardner's knitting needles clicked in nervous anticipation. Blanchard's sketchbook lay open on his lap, but he did not touch pencil or charcoal. Clara clutched her diary, its pages marked with fluttering ribbons. Poirot watched each with piercing scrutiny. He nodded first to Mr. Blanchard. The artist rose and cleared his throat. He began, voice quavering. After dinner, I went to the stables to sketch the horses. I returned to the common room at 7:30, found it empty, and fetched my sketchbook from my room. He swallowed. I then sketched the Willow from the hallway window until 8. At 8:30, I walked past the study, saw Miss Fairfax's door ajar, and heard voices. I paused, then continued to the billiard room, where I paced until 10. He hesitated, glancing at Clara. After 10, I returned to my room, drank mint tea, and went to bed. Poirot's gaze remained impassive, but I saw his moustaches twitch. Next, Mrs. Gardner stood, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. I spent the evening knitting in my room until 8. Then I walked the corridor to fetch more yarn from the supply closet. On my way, I passed Mr. Merrow's study. I heard the rustle of pages and his voice calling someone's name. I did not pause. I proceeded to the pantry for chamomile, mixing the tea at 9, which I placed on a tray to serve at breakfast. She looked at the teapot. That is all. Finally, Clara Denby rose, diary in hand. I returned to my room at 7 to record the day's events. At 8, I emerged and saw Mrs. Gardner with a tray. I followed her to the pantry, but she left before I could speak. I waited in the corridor and saw Blanchard return from the stables. We exchanged nods. I then walked down to the Willow, hoping to calm my thoughts of Mr. Merrow's proposal. Clara's voice trembled. I hid behind the tree. He approached. I told him I did not love him. He begged. I ran. I returned to the inn by 11, cold and afraid. I went straight to bed. Poirot nodded after each account. Then he tapped the table. Thank you. Now we shall examine their veracity. He turned first to the summons note. Mr. Blanchard, you claimed to hear voices at Miss Fairfax's study at 8:30. Yet the ink on this note is still wet at 9. Who could have penned it at such hour? Was it you, monsieur? Blanchard's face paled. No, I merely paused to listen. I did not write it. Poirot produced the porcelain fragment. Mrs. Gardner, you said you took chamomile from the pantry at 9, then left the teapot by the hearth. Yet this fragment was found at the Willow, broken before midnight. You claim you did not depart the inn again until morning? She swallowed. I did not. I remained inside. Yet, Poirot said quietly, this fragment bears the mark of a saucer from your private set. Only you, or someone with access to your china cabinet, could break it, and I know your study key fits both your cabinet and the pantry. Mrs. Gardner's hands trembled. I did not leave my room after 9. Poirot turned to Clara. Mademoiselle, you saw Mrs. Gardner with a tray at 8, but you did not mention seeing her return from the pantry with a broken cup, and yet this fragment suggests she did. Clara stared, tears welling. Why did you not speak then? Clara's voice faltered. I was frightened and confused. Poirot's gaze returned to me, then back to the group. Now observe the teapot. He lifted the porcelain vessel. This morning, someone attempted to poison Mr. Hastings by adding a sedative to the common tea service. Mrs. Gardner claims only to have used this teapot for chamomile, but Mrs. Penfold's cook, Mrs. Monroe, testified that only this teapot was ever handled by staff. You, Mrs. Gardner, had the perfect opportunity to tamper. Mrs. Gardner clutched her shawl. No, I brewed my herbs in the small china pot I keep in my room. Poirot shook his head, yet the tea served to Mr. Hastings was drawn from this very teapot. He tapped the spout, and the only person who handled both services last night was you. His voice grew gentler. Why, madame? Mrs. Gardner's shoulders collapsed. She sobbed, voice cracking. He threatened me. He said his calls would be made public, my reputation, my home, my future. I had nothing left. I only intended to incapacitate your friend, Monsieur Hastings, to delay Poirot's interference. I did not kill him. She buried her face in her hands. Poirot offered his handkerchief. Madame, your confession of attempted poisoning aligns with your fear, but what of Mr. Merrow's death? She shook her head vigorously. I did not kill him. I never left my room after 9. I hid the fragment when I realized my error, afraid to face discovery. But the murder, I swear it was not me. Blanchard leaned forward. Poirot. Then who? Poirot turned, gaze sweeping the room. The one who remains, Mr. Blanchard. Blanchard's eyes widened. You confessed to selling information to Merrow, and your sketches depict shadowed forms. You heard voices and watched arguments, but only you possessed the artistic skill to manipulate evidence, planting the porcelain fragment, forging the summons note by sampling ink and texture and anticipating all questions. Blanchard rose, face ashen. No, I only painted his praise. I never meant to kill. Poirot's voice was calm but firm. Yet you did. You confronted him by the Willow after Clara fled. Lured by your own summons, a quarrel ensued, words escalated. In a heartbeat, you pushed him into the water. He paused. The stage was set for Mrs. Gardner's misguided poisoning, the arrest of Ms. Fairfax, the psychological tests, all distractions of your own devising. Blanchard's shoulders sagged. He buried his face in his hands. I lost control. He laughed at me, called me a fool. I struck him. He fell. Poirot nodded. And in panic you concealed the body, staged the footprints, and planted evidence to implicate others. A mind desperate to hide its crime orchestrates the chaos of many. Inspector Bedford, who had entered silently, stepped forward and placed a hand on Blanchard's shoulder. The artist is under arrest for the murder of Julian Merrow. Blanchard did not resist. He turned to me, eyes hollow. Hastings, I'm sorry. Poirot watched as the constables led Blanchard away. Then he surveyed the remaining 3, Mrs. Gardner, Clara Denby, and myself. Thus ends the confrontation, he said, voice gentle. The murderer revealed himself through the very chaos he created. Mrs. Gardner's fear led to a secondary crime, and Clara's silence prolonged the confusion. But justice finds its way. He looked at Mrs. Gardner. Your debt is forgiven, madame. The courts will consider your attempt with leniency. Then to Clara, and you, Mademoiselle Denby, your courage in observing and testifying has served us well. He turned to me, smiling. Mon ami, the little grey cells have triumphed once more. Outside, the willow's branches brushed against the window pane as though signalling the end of a long, dark tale and the promise of peace restored to the banks of the River Cherwell. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. Shortly after midnight, the corridors of Willowmere Inn lay silent but for the occasional creak of floorboards and the distant hoot of an owl. The arrest of Mr. Theodore Blanchard had settled an uneasy calm over the household until a sharp commotion shattered the quiet. I was roused from uneasy sleep by the sound of hurried footsteps and the jangle of metal. Hastening to the corridor outside Poirot's suite, I found Inspector Bedford and 2 constables standing by the heavy oak door of the spare rooms. Something's amiss, Bedford muttered, examining the lock. Blanchard was held in room 7. The door's ajar, and his cell key is gone. Poirot emerged, dressing gown trailing softly. His moustaches bristled with alert purpose. Madness, he declared. The room's window. He strode past us and peered into the moonlit courtyard through the open sash. "He has fled." The constables darted down the corridor as Poirot and I followed. Gasps came from the lobby below. The front door stood wide, and footprints in the gravel led into the shadowed grounds. Poirot tapped his temple. A frightened mind seizes opportunity. Let us pursue. We burst into the cool night air. The path from the inn wound through a thicket of yews toward the riverbank, and there, under the willow's rustling boughs, we glimpsed Blanchard, coat flapping, darting toward the water's edge. In one hand he clutched something small and wrapped in cloth. Bedford and the constables sprinted after him, but Blanchard had a head start. I followed with fleeting steps, heart pounding. He neared the bank, where the soft earth gave way to mud, and with a desperate glance over his shoulder, he dashed across the reeds. Poirot caught up, cane swinging. "Mon Dieu, Hastings, watch the footing!" Blanchard slipped in the mud, dropping his parcel into the river with a splash before regaining his balance and scrambling up the opposite bank. I paused at the water's edge, toes sinking. Poirot stood beside me, unwavering. "He has discarded evidence," Poirot said quietly. "We must retrieve it and recapture him." Bedford waded in, retrieving a sodden bundle from the current. It was Clara Denby's diary, bound in leather. Pages fluttered, waterlogging the ink. Blanchard had intended to destroy the record of his threats and sketches. "How dare he!" exclaimed Clara, who had followed with Mrs. Penfold and a lantern. She snatched her diary, examining the ruined pages. "My notes, the entries about last night, gone." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Desperate measures often betray the most cunning guilt, mademoiselle." He pressed a handkerchief to the wet pages. "Yet fragments may still be legible." Meanwhile, a shout rose ahead. Blanchard had reached a low stone wall bordering the estate. He scaled it with surprising agility, landing in a field beyond. Bedford and the constables skidded to a halt. Poirot and I arrived moments later. Blanchard turned, panting, clutching his sides. In the lantern glow, his face was gaunt, wild with fear. Poirot raised a hand. "Monsieur Blanchard, enough of this folly." Blanchard shook his head. "You don't understand. My reputation, my life, ruined." He lurched forward, then paused as a constable advanced. With one final desperate surge, Blanchard pushed past the officer and sprinted down the field toward the river. The ground sloped, and he stumbled, sprawling in the damp grass. The cold dawn air bit at his cheeks as the constables closed in. Bedford crouched beside him, gripping his arm. "It's over, Blanchard. You're cornered." Panting, Blanchard raised his hands in surrender. As the constables bound him, he fell back against the wet earth. Poirot knelt and offered a handkerchief. "Mon ami," he said gently, "endurance in wrongdoing brings only despair." I approached, gathering the discarded fragments. The crumpled note pouch, a broken pencil, and a scrap of canvas from Blanchard's satchel. He had intended to flee with these, perhaps seeking refuge in anonymity. Clara knelt to inspect her diary. "Some passages are still legible," she said, relief mingling with sorrow. "We can reconstruct the entries." Poirot rose, cane tapping on the dewy grass. The willow's branches dripped silver beads of moonlit dew. The attempt to escape was a final unveiling. Blanchard sought both to obliterate his incriminating records and to flee before justice. Yet even in flight, he left traces, footprints in the mud, the river's current as witness, and a broken will laid bare by desperate action. Inspector Bedford helped Blanchard to his feet. "The magistrate will want to hear of this escape and evidence destruction." Poirot inclined his head. Indeed, and the psychological weight of failure may yet loosen further confessions. He looked at me, eyes alight. Mon ami, the secondary mystery revealed its own resolution. Tomorrow we shall deliver the final reckoning. As Blanchard was escorted back toward the inn, the first pale light of dawn brushed the horizon. The willow shivered in the breeze as though whispering its last secrets. And in that hush, I understood anew that no flight, nor the swiftest currents, can wash away the stain of guilt when one's own conscience serves as the truest witness. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The morning after Blanchard's desperate flight, the air at Willowmere Inn was crisp with the promise of autumn. I joined Poirot in the small laboratory the inspector had arranged in the billiard room, an improvised space for sorting evidence. The table was strewn with recovered diary fragments, ink vials, boot imprints casts, and remnants of the broken locket Clara Denby had worn. Poirot examined each item with his usual precision, sipping tea as the constables and Mrs. Penfold's cook, Mrs. Munro, hovered nearby. "Mon ami," Poirot said softly, tapping a legible diary page, "we have yet one piece to confirm the trajectory of this crime. The reconstruction of Clara's diary shows an entry at 9:05 p.m. He beckoned me to the willow. My heart pounded. I refused and fled toward the reeds. That aligns with Blanchard's timeline, but also explains why Clara's footprints veered into the swamp below the route. She stumbled and turned back. Yet someone else must have followed to finish the deed. I nodded as Poirot shifted his gaze to a cast of the Daisy Compass bootprint. Beside it lay Mrs. Gardner's knitting needles, Mrs. Fairfax's contract amendments, and a swatch of Blanchard's canvas. The boots tracked from the willow to the study corridor, Poirot continued. Then, after Blanchard returned in borrowed brogues, he changed back into his own shoes. That switch left the floral imprint near Fairfax's door, intended to frame her further. He set aside the print and studied the vial of river water. The chemical analysis confirms no sedative in the river, only traces of crushed lavender and chamomile consistent with Mrs. Gardner's garden. Thus, the attempt to incapacitate Hastings with tea was separate, as we know. Yet the lack of any toxic residue in the river water clears Mrs. Gardner of the murder itself. Poirot paused, drawing from his pocket the small, broken locket Clara had found at the crime scene. Clara's locket bore the initials CD. Yet this locket was found under the willow, near the porcelain fragment. Blanchard must have dropped it when he moved Merrow's body, intending to discard incriminating personal effects. He tapped the locket. It told us two truths at once: that Clara's innocence was genuine, and that Blanchard had been at the scene without her knowledge. He arranged the key items in chronological order, the summons note penned on Blanchard's test paper, 8:55 p.m., Clara's flight from the willow, 9:05 p.m., Blanchard's concealment of the body, 9:10 p.m., the porcelain fragment dropped in panic, 9:12 p.m., and the attempt to frame Mrs. Fairfax with the floral sole boots, 9:20 p.m. "Every action leaves a mark, Hastings," he murmured, "and every mark fits into the pattern of guilt." As the inspector returned with fresh documents from the local laboratory, Poirot reviewed the final water report. The tea residue contained a mild sedative derived from lavender tincture, a recipe found in Mrs. Gardner's herbal compendium. Thus, the secondary crime, attempted poisoning, was her own, born of desperation. But the primary crime remains singular. Blanchard alone had the motive of wounded pride, the skill to fabricate clues, and the audacity to murder. Poirot closed the ledger and turned to me. Mon ami, the game is complete. We now possess the chain of evidence unbroken. Diary, print casts, glass fragment, locket, and toxicology. Tomorrow, at the final gathering, we shall present this sequence to the magistrate and bring both criminals to justice. That evening, the surviving guests assembled in the drawing room for Poirot's last reading. Ms. Fairfax, Mrs. Gardner, Clara Denby, Inspector Bedford, and I sat in a semicircle as Poirot rose, cane in hand. He recounted the timeline, holding each piece of evidence aloft in turn. He narrated Blanchard's descent from artist to murderer, Mrs. Gardner's panicked attempt to poison Hastings, and Clara's courageous testimony. With each revelation, the guests nodded, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. Finally, Poirot folded his notes. And so, mesdames et messieurs, the threads of deception are woven no more. The locket under the willow, the fragment of porcelain, the borrowed boots, and the poisoned tea all converge upon the minds of two desperate souls, one who struck in fury, the other who lashed out in fear. He bowed. May justice be served, and may the truth of human frailty guide us toward compassion. Inspector Bedford rose to escort Mrs. Gardner to explain her attempted poisoning, then led in Blanchard under guard. Ms. Fairfax and Clara Denby embraced, supportive at last. And as the door closed, the drawing room felt lighter, as though the willow's long shadows had finally retreated. Outside, the River Cherwell flowed quietly beneath the moonlight, carrying away the night's dark secrets. Within, Poirot sank into his favourite armchair, the little grey cells at rest, confident that not a single clue had been left unturned. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. At dawn's first light, the mist clung to the willow grove like a gauzy veil as Hercule Poirot summoned the remaining guests to the river bank. The dewy grass glistened under a pale sky, and the sturdy trunk of the willow, scene of both crime and concealment, loomed as a silent witness. Ms. Eloise Fairfax, Mrs. Louise Gardiner, and Clara Denby gathered upon the embankment, their breath visible in the chill air. Inspector Bedford stood nearby with constables, while I remained at Poirot's side, notebook in hand. Poirot surveyed the assembly with calm authority. "Mesdames," he began, voice steady, "we convene once more at the very locus of tragedy. Here, beneath these branches, Mr. Julian Merrow met his end, and here we shall retrace the final moments. I ask you to witness this reconstruction, that the sequence of events may speak for itself." He gestured to 3 markers placed in a shallow arc: the location of the summons, the spot of Clara's stumble, and the precise bank where the body was concealed. Clara Denby stepped forward first. Poirot nodded. "Mademoiselle, please stand at the first marker, the summons post. Recall your steps." She moved to a fence post, still bearing faint scratches where the note was once nailed. Clara steadied herself, closing her eyes. "He held my hand there," she said softly. "He showed me the note. I remember the hush in the air." She lifted her hand to the post. Then I stepped back, reluctant to read it, fearing its message. She paused, gaze fixed on the water. He urged me forward, but I refused. Poirot inclined his head. "Très bien. Now, Miss Fairfax, please join us at the second marker, Clara's point of flight." Eloise walked to a small root jutting from the bank, where flattened grass still curved away. She paused where a footprint had etched itself into soft soil. "I saw Clara there, trembling as I walked toward the willow," Fairfax murmured. I thought she needed help." She bent to inspect the ground. Her slipper had caught on this root. She stumbled and fell back. Her voice broke. I offered my hand, but she recoiled and fled. Poirot pressed a gloved finger into the earth. Notice the angle of her fall, away from the water, and the absence of footprints beyond this point. Clara did not approach the body. He straightened, turning to Mrs. Gardner. Madame, at the third marker, the concealment site, please show us your movements. Louise Gardner stepped to a spot where the earth was darkened and the mud pressed unevenly beneath her boots. She knelt, brushing away a scattering of fallen leaves. I came here, she said, voice low, to gather chamomile for breakfast, but I slipped, dropped my bundle, and struggled. She rose. I never saw the body. I only noticed disturbed soil and moved this log, thinking to step past safely. She tapped the log's base. I did not know what lay beneath. Poirot surveyed the three women. You each played a part in the events of that night without realizing the full horror of what transpired. Now I ask you to join me in reenacting the path Mr. Merrow took, alone from the summons to his fate. He led them back to the fence post, then guided a measured pace downstream toward the concealment site. Each woman placed a footfall at the spot where he would have walked. Under the willow's arching boughs, their shadows intertwined on the water. When they reached the final marker, Poirot turned to us all. Now stand apart and observe the bank. The inspector and I stepped back, allowing the three to cluster near a raised root. Picture Mr. Merrow here, Poirot continued, voice resonant. He read the summons, hesitated, then advanced. He crossed this route, paused, with hopes perhaps of solace or negotiation, before tragedy struck. He raised his cane, tracing a swift arc. Observe that only one pair of footprints led from here into the water, those of a gentler tread, not matching Blanchard's heavy boots, nor the lieutenant's military sole. They belonged to a slippered foot. He indicated fine impressions, almost lost in the mud. Miss Fairfax, these prints match your silk slippers from dinner. Fairfax inhaled sharply, hand flying to her throat. My grandmother's slippers, she whispered. I wore them last night. Clara gasped. Eloise, Mrs. Gardner's brow furrowed. But Miss Fairfax could not have reached the willow without disturbing us. Poirot nodded. Precisely. Her footsteps mislead both Clara and Mrs. Gardner, since only one among you carried those slippers that night. He turned to Eloise. Mademoiselle, you arrived at the willow after Clara fled, but before our murderer returned to conceal the body. He paused, gaze steady. Yet why did you come alone, knowing danger lurked in that grove? Fairfax's eyes filled. He begged me to join him, said he needed my counsel. I walked quietly and found him lifeless. Her voice trembled. I screamed, then fled. Poirot's moustaches twitched. Thank you. Let us now consider the concealment. He crouched, examining the root under which the body lay. Footprints here are deeper, larger, and bearing the floral compass motif. He pointed downstream. And here, he tapped the section toward the study, are smaller prints matching Clara's slippers. Each woman peered where he indicated, the grove silent, but for the river's murmur. He rose, turning to face them. Thus, our sequence. Mr. Merrow was lured by a personal summons, brought here by someone in slippers, then struck by another, whose boot left the floral print. The body was dragged under this route by booted feet, and the slippers returned to the inn to divert suspicion. He placed his cane between the prints. The final piece, a porcelain fragment dropped here bearing the monogram L.B., the initials of Lucy Beaumont, Miss Fairfax's grandmother. Fairfax's lip quivered. Mrs. Gardner crossed herself. Clara's hand flew to her locket. Poirot allowed the moment to linger, each face illuminated by dawning comprehension. "At this gathering," he continued, "we have followed the true path of footsteps and fragments, and so the final gathering concludes with only one possible author of both the summons and the concealment, one who walked in slippers, bore knowledge of a personal summons, and wore boots to commit violence." He gestured to the cluster of footprints. "Do you see now, mesdames? The riverbank does not lie. The reeds, the root, the scattered porcelain, all confirm the convergence of motive and opportunity." He paused, voice soft but unyielding. "Tomorrow morning justice will demand the name of our murderer. For now return to the inn and contemplate these truths beneath the willow's silent witness." As the women retraced their steps back to the fence post, I caught Eloise Fairfax's gloved hand shake, Clara's tears glimmering on her cheeks, and Mrs. Gardner's shawl twisting in her fingers. Poirot remained at the concealment site, eyes fixed upon the river's gentle flow. In that stillness, the final gathering had spoken its silent verdict, one that only the murderer could now defy without betraying themselves utterly. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The sun had climbed higher by the time Hercule Poirot called the remaining assembly to the willow tree crossing once more. The morning mist had dissipated, revealing the silvered waters of the Cherwell and the gnarled roots beneath the willow's sweeping boughs. Standing in a loose semicircle were Clara Denby and Eloise Fairfax, both pale but resolute, Inspector Bedford, and I, notebook at the ready. Poirot held in his hand a leather folder containing the final evidence, and his expression was one of grim satisfaction. "Mesdames," he began, voice clear against the whispering leaves, "we have retraced footsteps, examined fragments, and reconstructed every moment of that fateful night. Now I shall expose the true culprit and exonerate the innocent." He paused, sliding the folder closed. "Observe the 3 sets of footprints upon this bank." He pointed to the shallow indent where Clara first fled, the deeper boot prints that followed, and the slipper impressions at the fence post. "The slipper prints here," Poirot said, indicating the route where Clara stumbled, "match exactly the delicate sole of your walking slippers, Mademoiselle Denby." Clara's throat constricted, but her eyes met his steadily. "You walked with Mr. Merrow after he read the summons," Poirot continued. "Your locket fell when he pleaded his love. Your flight was natural and innocent. You did not kill him." Clara exhaled, relief softening her features. Poirot moved to the larger prints. "These boot prints, 3 daisies encircling a compass rose, belong solely to Mr. Theodore Blanchard." He gestured to the still visible mud casts. "You returned here later, monsieur, under cover of darkness. You concealed the body, dropped the fragment of your private porcelain in panic, and sought to frame others. Your sketches, your stolen stationery, your careful mimicry of Miss Fairfax's handwriting, all were but threads of your contrivance." He stepped back, letting the weight of his words settle. "Mr. Blanchard has confessed. Wounded pride turned to deadly violence. He struck Mr. Merrow when rebuffed, then hastily staged footprints and clues to distract. His desperate flight this morning betrayed his guilt when he attempted to destroy Clara's diary, proof of his misdeeds, and fled with it into the night." Poirot nodded to Inspector Bedford, who spoke crisply. "Mr. Blanchard is under arrest for the murder of Julien Merrow. We shall escort him to Oxford for the formal charge." The constables emerged from the trees to lead him forward, face bowed, restraints in place. Poirot then turned to Mrs. Louise Gardiner, who had accompanied us. "Madame," he said gently, You attempted to poison my friend Hastings, drawn by fear of your own ruin. Though a secondary crime born of desperation, it stands separate from the primary tragedy here." He folded his arms. "You will answer for that tonight, but know that your confession and cooperation have tempered the judgment against you." Mrs. Gardner inclined her head, tears glimmering. "I will answer for my actions, Monsieur Poirot." At last Poirot addressed Eloise Fairfax, whose fine riding habit was now a simple grey walking coat. "Mademoiselle, you too suffered the weight of suspicion." He offered her a small bow. "Your grandmother's slippers were planted to mislead us toward you. But you did not wield the pen that summoned Mr. Merrow, nor did you conceal the body. Your courage in facing the final gathering has proven your innocence." Fairfax's shoulders relaxed for the first time. She exhaled a shuddering breath and met Clara's gaze. "Thank you," she whispered. Poirot turned to me, a slow smile beneath his waxed moustaches. "Mon ami, the tapestry is at last untangled. The little grey cells have discerned truth from deception, exposing the lone hand that committed murder." He tapped the leather folder. "Let us now collect these final relics of evidence, stationery, porcelain, boots, and deliver them to Inspector Bedford." Within moments the constables gathered the porcelain fragment, the torn note, and the boot casts. Poirot swept one last glance over the rippling water and the sentinel Willow. "Thus ends the affair at Hercule Poirot and the death at the Willow Tree Crossing. May justice be served to those who deserved it, and may the innocent find peace at last." As the group dispersed, Clara and Eloise leaning on each other, Mrs. Gardner escorted to await medical attention, and the inspector leading Blanchard away, Poirot placed his cane under his arm and turned to me. "Mon ami," he said softly, "every life altered by this tragedy bears its own scars. But through careful observation and empathy, we have preserved truth and ensured that justice prevails." He paused, eyes luminous with satisfaction. "Now, Hastings, shall we return to Willowmere Inn for the magistrate's formalities, and perhaps a well-deserved cup of tea?" I nodded, closing my notebook. As we walked back up the dew-soaked path, the willow's branches fell silent, its final secrets entrusted to the river's gentle flow and to the memory of Hercule Poirot's unerring intellect. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. By noon, Willowmere Inn's drawing room had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom. Inspector Bedford stood at one end, flanked by constables, while Mrs. Penfold arranged chairs for witnesses and observers. I sat beside Poirot at a small table piled with evidence, stationery bearing the reversed LB watermark, the porcelain fragment, Clara Denby's partially restored diary entries, and the daisy compass boot casts. The late Julian Merrow's attorney, Mr. Winslow, arrived with the local magistrate, Mr. Aldridge, whose stern visage lent solemnity to the proceedings. Poirot rose as the magistrate took his seat. "Your worship," he said, bowing, "I present the evidence and testimony in the case of Mr. Julian Merrow's death at Willow Tree Crossing on September 14th. He gestured to the items on the table. "We have established beyond doubt that Mr. Theodore Blanchard lured the victim with a forged summons, written on his experimental paper and disguised in Miss Fairfax's handwriting. He then committed the act of murder beneath this willow, concealed the body, and planted misleading clues to implicate others." Poirot laid out the sequence concisely. The summons note at 8:55 p.m., Clara's flight at 9:05 p.m., Blanchard's act and concealment at 9:10 p.m., and the porcelain fragment's panic drop at 9:12 p.m. The magistrate examined the porcelain shard. "The monogram matches the stationary watermark?" he asked. "Precisely," Poirot confirmed. "A single private teacup and matching paper stored together, combined in a moment of panic." He then turned to Mrs. Gardner's attempted poisoning. "I also present evidence that Mrs. Louise Gardner, in fear of financial ruin, tampered with the common teapot this morning, adding a mild sedative derived from her herbal tinctures. Though her intent was to incapacitate, not to kill, the act constitutes attempted manslaughter." He placed the teapot and Madame Gardner's herbal compendium before the magistrate. Mr. Aldridge tapped his gavel. "Very well. Inspector Bedford, are the defendants in custody?" The inspector stepped forward. "Yes, Your Worship. Mr. Theodore Blanchard and Mrs. Louise Gardner await formal charge and sentencing." Poirot produced Clara's diary. "May I submit this as corroborative testimony?" The magistrate nodded, and Poirot read Alf brightly. Clara's entry: "I never loved him, yet his persistence wounded me. I fled when my heart broke." He closed the diary. Mademoiselle Denby's truthfulness and bravery in preserving this record were instrumental. Mr. Aldridge cleared his throat. "Ms. Clara Denby, you stand exonerated of any complicity. Ms. Eloise Fairfax, having been wrongfully suspected, you too are cleared of all charges." He looked to Fairfax, who inclined her head with quiet relief. Turning to the defendants, the magistrate's tone hardened. "Mr. Theodore Blanchard, you stand convicted of the willful murder of Julian Merrow. The evidence presented is overwhelming. Mrs. Louise Gardner, you stand convicted of attempted manslaughter through the administration of a noxious substance. This court must now consider appropriate sentences." Poirot bowed his head in deference as the magistrate consulted his notes. After a brief pause, Mr. Aldridge spoke. "Mr. Blanchard, for the crime of murder, this court sentences you to penal servitude for life, to be served at Her Majesty's pleasure. Mrs. Gardner, for attempted manslaughter, you are sentenced to 5 years penal servitude, taking into account your cooperation and the absence of prior offences." Gasps and soft sobs filled the room. Mrs. Gardner clasped her hands, tears glistening. Blanchard lowered his head without protest. Poirot stepped forward. "Your Worship, I thank the court for judicious clemency toward Mrs. Gardner and for swift justice regarding Mr. Blanchard." The magistrate inclined his head. "Let this serve as warning. Deceit and violence yield only ruin." With the formalities concluded, Inspector Bedford escorted the convicts out. Clara Denby, Eloise Fairfax, and I accompanied Poirot to the veranda, where Mrs. Penfold offered fragrant tea and scones. The river's gentle murmur provided a soothing backdrop. Clara's voice trembled as she spoke. "I can never thank you enough, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot smiled kindly. "Courage, mademoiselle. Your honesty allowed justice its path." Fairfax clasped his hand. "Your intervention spared me disgrace." "Justice," Poirot replied, "is the natural fruit of truth. Our task was to coax that truth from the shadows." He looked at me. "Mon ami, our work is done." As the afternoon sun warmed the veranda, the guests sipped their tea in contemplative silence. Outside, the willow's branches swayed gently over the river, their whispered farewell to those who had suffered and those who had served justice. And so, in the quiet aftermath, life at Willowmere Inn resumed its gentle rhythms, forever altered by tragedy, but guided forward by the steadfast hand of Hercule Poirot and the enduring triumph of the little grey cells. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. As twilight settled over Willowmere Inn, painting the sky in dusky rose and violet, I joined Hercule Poirot on the veranda overlooking the River Cherwell. The inn's windows glowed warmly behind us, and a gentle breeze scented the air with fallen leaves and brewing lavender. The day's tumult, murder, misdirection, attempted poisoning, and the final gathering had given way to a hush of reflection. Poirot leaned on his cane, moustaches waxed and gleaming in the fading light. "Mon ami," he began softly, "today the little grey cells have traced every whisper of deceit to its source, delivered justice where it was due, and restored peace to this once troubled estate." He paused, gaze drifting to the willow whose branches brushed the water's surface. "But beyond the legal judgments, we must consider the human cost." I nodded, recalling Clara Denby's tears and Mrs. Gardiner's anguish. "Each life here has been altered," I said. "Clara lost the friend she never wished to have. Mrs. Gardiner faces atonement for her desperate act, and Miss Fairfax endures the memory of wrongful suspicion." Poirot smiled with gentle gravitas. "Precisely, Hastings. Justice in human affairs is never absolute. There is always a measure of sorrow. Yet it is our duty to balance truth with compassion." He stepped toward a small table where tea sat cooling. "Come, let us sip our tea and bid farewell to Willowmere's ghosts." As we sat, Mrs. Penfold emerged with fresh cups and delicate scones. She offered them with a trembling smile. "You have done more for us than any magistrate, monsieur," she said to Poirot, eyes bright with gratitude. He accepted a cup. "Madame, you provided comfort and candour where deceit sought refuge. Your kindness was a beacon in dark times." Across the veranda, Clara approached, her diary clutched to her chest. She knelt by Poirot's chair. "Monsieur," she whispered, "you have given me back my future. I shall never forget your kindness." Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle, the courage to speak one's truth is the greatest gift. May you carry that courage always." Eloise Fairfax joined us, hands folded, her expression serene. "I wish to thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I feared scandal would end my life. Instead, I have found new resolve." She glanced at Clara, offering a gentle nod. "Perhaps we shall meet again, under happier circumstances." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Friendship born of adversity can be the truest." A rustle from the inn announced Mrs. Gardiner's quiet return. She paused on the threshold, shawl drawn tightly. Poirot rose to greet her. "Madame, how fare you after your morning ordeal?" She lowered her gaze. "Better, Monsieur Poirot. I face the consequences, but I am grateful for your mercy." She offered him a small bouquet of wild chamomile, picked from the riverbank. "For you, an antidote to sorrow." Touched, Poirot accepted the flowers. "Your generosity in offering beauty after tragedy speaks to the kindness that remains within you." As the last light faded, Poirot closed his eyes, inhaling the river-scented breeze. He opened them, meeting each face in turn. "Mes amis, our story here concludes not with the final word of the law, but with the enduring promise of redemption. Each of you has borne suffering, yet each of you shall find a new dawn." He looked at the willow, whose silhouette shimmered as dusk turned to night. "This tree has witnessed human frailty, secrets buried beneath its roots, tears shed by its trunk. But it also offers shelter and quiet reflection. So too must we find shelter in forgiveness and reflection in our shared humanity." I felt the weight of his words settle warmly around us. The river murmured its agreement, and the inn's lamps cast a golden glow that seemed to banish the day's shadows. Poirot tapped his cane lightly. "And now, Hastings, it is time for us to depart. The case is closed, the guilty punished, the innocent restored. Tomorrow, Willowmere will awaken as though this drama were but a dream, yet its lessons shall remain. I rose, offering him my arm. Lead the way, Poirot. He stood, adjusting his coat. Let us leave this place in peace, mon ami, and carry its quiet wisdom in our hearts. As we walked down the veranda steps, the guests murmured their farewells. Mrs. Penfold curtsied. Clara offered a final smile, Miss Fairfax bowed gracefully, and Mrs. Gardiner nodded with fragile hope. Poirot paused at the gate, turning once more to face the Willow's gentle sway. In the end, he said softly, it is not the thunderous reveal that matters most, but the quiet resolution that follows. With that, he lifted his cane, strode down the path with measured dignity, and disappeared into the gathering night. I followed, notebook closed, knowing that while the mystery had ended at Willow Tree Crossing, its echoes of justice and mercy would linger long in the silent waters and the hearts of those it touched.